Okay, I think that's about everybody from the waiting room. More people might trickle in, but I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to this webinar on our most recent study. This is the collaboration between Good Growth and Faunalytics. Our study examined Gen Z. So
Nee,
Gen
sie
Z is
liegt noch
this
da, aber ich habe
critical.
das Ding wiederum gemacht. Ich wollte sie gleich, also habe kurz da gesessen, aber
If you could, I believe someone is talking. At least I can hear it. If that person could mute themselves, please. Thank you very much. Um, So Gen Z is an important generation for every social movement, both in terms of as an audience that we need to engage with and as potential people to bring into the movement. So with these two lenses, we wanted to analyze Gen Z in four critical countries. We'll do a short presentation of the key findings and results, and then Jack, who is one of the study authors, I can ask him some questions, and we'll also have questions from the audience about the findings, how to apply them, how to understand them, and how they interact with the broader movement. So without further ado, let's jump in. So we can start with analyzing what we exactly did. How did we try to answer these questions? With our methods, there were surveys and surveys and open-ended questions with interviews as well. The participants tended to be more university educated and urban dwelling than the average populations of these countries. So that is something to keep in mind when analyzing the results. And there were nearly 400 total people that we looked into. There were four countries that were identified in the study: China, Thailand, Indonesia, and the United States. These countries were chosen for a few different reasons due to the level of activism in these regions and the number of farmed animals. All of these are pretty critical areas in the world when we consider the farmed animal movement. So that's who we looked at, pretty brief. We're just going to jump straight into the results because I know that's what everyone is most eager to look at. We found overall that most respondents don't think society is doing enough to safeguard animals and the environment. So this is a very big chart with a lot of colors here, but I'll help break it down for you. So especially in the United States, we have the red, orange, and yellow bars that indicate that they disagree with the statement that society is doing enough to safeguard animal well-being. So are over 70% in the United States and about 56% for all of the participants that we looked at. So they don't think society is doing enough. And when we asked them the same question about the environment, we saw pretty similar results, actually. This is a different chart, although the results do look relatively similar. We do see that most people don't think the society is doing enough. The only exception here is Indonesia, where about 42% of Indonesian Gen Z participants do think that don't disagree with that statement. So overall, we can see right away a big discrepancy. They do want to protect the environment, but they don't think society is doing enough. This is a feeling that we could perhaps tap into as advocates. However, they do have themselves positive attitudes towards the environment and animals. A vast majority say that they are somewhat concerned about the environment and animal welfare. And again, so the top bar here is the environment, the second bar here is animal welfare. Pretty similar results. Do keep in mind that this question didn't specify any particular type of animal. So when they were answering this question, they could be thinking about wild animals, companion animals, farmed animals, or anything really. So just keep that in mind that this is animal welfare in general. But again, it is helpful to understand that they do consider animals and the environment worthy of protection and worthy of concern. When we asked them, do they prefer products that minimize environmental damage or minimize harm to animals, a majority said that they do, a large majority actually. Again, we didn't specify exactly which products these are, and this goes into one of the tensions within the research actually, which is they might think that the products they are consuming are minimizing harm, but in reality, they might not actually be. So this is something for activists to keep in mind: is they want products that minimize harm. They want these animals in the environment to be safeguarded. But sometimes there is a gap of knowledge there that we'll get into later in this presentation. Some other things that have stuck out from the survey are that so when we ask them if they want to engage in the movements themselves or take on some sort of NGO, nonprofit job, some government work, their barriers to taking action were practical, not ideological. So they didn't say something like, I don't believe in the cause. I don't think animals are worth protecting. I don't think the environment is worth protecting. They said, I don't think I can make enough money. I don't think I have the skills to do this. I don't think I can find a job where I live that could do this. So this should indicate that if we want to bring people in, we need to be working on removing these practical barriers, not ideological, where they are already relatively convinced that this is important. So we need to make it easier for them. And then many reasons to act were not anthropocentric. In other words, when we ask them things like, why do you care about the environment? Why do you care about animals? They didn't say inherently because taking care of the environment is good for the economy or something like that, or good for humanity. They often said things like it's good to take care of the environment because it's a good, it has worth of its own right. Same for animals. This to me is a rather optimistic finding. By acknowledging that their motivations aren't anthropocentric, it can be easier to draw them in to the movement, which in some ways isn't anthropocentric at all. Environmental actions were more common than animal actions. And like I mentioned before, farmed animals were especially neglected. So when they brought up types of animals, they didn't mention farmed animals as much as other categories of animals. I don't think this should be surprising to anybody listening here. We've seen this in other types of research all over, and we probably can attest to this in our own conversations with people all over the world. But still, we did replicate this information in the study. One of the things that they identified as a potential tool for change was education. They really want to educate younger people about the importance of animals, the importance of the environment, how to protect it. This is especially prominent in Asia. And when they want to change their behavior, they always tended to mention mitigating personal harms rather than engaging proactively. To give an example of what this means, they would rather say something like, I'm trying to reduce the amount of plastic I consume rather than joining a nonprofit to curb plastic use in a certain area or country. So they tend to focus on their own impact on animals or the environment, or I will reduce my meat consumption as opposed to working on a diet change organization. So this kind of indicates a little gap, right? If advocates can try to engage Gen Z, they could be working on this message of if you want to make change, you have to do it in a proactive, systematic way. And that they don't tend to think of this at the moment. They tend to think about personal action, not systemic action. So I think this is a key step we could be taking in the movement to engage this generation. So those are some overall insights, and we're going to ask Jack his opinion on some more of the key findings in a second. But we also have some specific insights per country. We actually have in the full website, in the full report on the website, multiple sections and words and paragraphs all about one country, just because if you're an activist in that country, we think those findings will be most relevant to you. But I'll give a brief overview now. In Thailand, we can see that they are actually more likely to have changed their lifestyles and considered careers than people in the other countries that we surveyed. So in this chart, the Thai respondents are in the blue, and the other averages are in the orange here. So 90% have made some sort of lifestyle change, and over 70% have considered a career. So if you're a Thai activist, there's a huge amount of young Thai people who are considering these careers, and that's kind of an untapped market, or at least that market is larger than it is in other countries. So there's a lot of potential there. Again, I think this is optimistic. This is very exciting. I love when I see stuff like this. It shows that there's a lot of paths forward for the movement. The next country was China. So this is a summary of some of their survey answers. 77% have made lifestyle changes, 46% are interested in jobs, 50% believe China is doing enough for the environment, and 46 believe it's doing enough for animal well-being. However, personally, 93% believe they are personally doing enough, and 87% believe they are personally doing enough for animal well-being, 93% for the environment. So they are more likely to think that they themselves are doing enough compared to society. Then we have the United States, and here we can see a different trend. US respondents were a bit more pessimistic, let's say, overall. Only about between a little over 10%, around 15% or so, believe that society is doing enough for the environment and animals compared to the average of these other countries. You can see that in the blue. Very low. They don't have a very optimistic understanding of their government. And then when we ask them if they are personally doing enough, they also don't think that they are personally doing enough themselves as compared to the other countries that we looked at. So just around 50%, about half, believe that they think they are personally doing enough to safeguard the environment and animals. Keep in mind that these questions are subjective. So this doesn't necessarily mean that US Gen Z is doing less than Thai Gen Z or Indonesian Gen Z. It means that they think they are doing less. So maybe they have a larger perspective of what is doing enough for animals and the environment, but they just don't think enough work is being done compared to these other countries. And finally, Indonesia. Indonesian respondents have the opposite. They are more likely to say that society and themselves are doing enough by a pretty considerable margin here. About 90% believe that they are personally doing enough for the environment and animals, and around half think that the society is doing enough, which is far larger than these other countries. So if you're in Indonesia, if you're an activist in Indonesia, many of the young people already think enough work is being done, either from themselves or the government or society. That might prove another burden, another challenge to overcome. So instead of engaging with the youth, you might have to work on education and showing what work is it being done right now. That might be an extra step that might need to be done in Indonesia as compared to somewhere like the United States. As usual, if you have questions about the study, you can come to our office hours where we can answer your questions, or you can email us online, or you can ask in this webinar, of course. But if you have very specific questions, come to our office hours. So with that, I want to turn it over to Jack, and I want to ask you what other key findings and recommendations stick out to you from the study that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet.
Sure. Yeah, I'll start with a couple of key findings. So one thing that really stuck out to me was the difference between systemic and individual focus when it comes to solutions to the problems that Gen Z perceive in their country. So we asked open-ended questions about whether people believe that solutions can be systemic, for example, using government, private sector, public sector interventions, or whether solutions will be down to education, grassroots solutions. And looking at the open-ended data, we found that there was like two broadly different viewpoints, where one group of people thought that both the problems and the solutions were very systemic, mainly to do with government and the private sector, and another group who thought that these problems were mainly due to individual ignorance, for example, a lack of education, and they believed that the solutions were related to these, so educating the general public. We found that these systemic attitudes were more common in the US, and individual-focused attitudes were much more common in Indonesia. So, for example, almost all Indonesian respondents would say the big problem is education in our country. The big problem is that people are not very good at thinking about these issues. People are not educated enough. And yeah, this I thought was very important because it indicates that there may be differences between, for example, education levels and the level of influence that, for example, corporate and public sector factors have on environmental and animal problems in these countries. But it could also be true that younger people need to recognize that a lot of these problems that their country is facing are systemic. And it seems that there's potentially a gap in Asia in particular in this regard. And in terms of other country-specific key findings, one thing that really struck out to me was that Chinese respondents were particularly likely to be apathetic, to believe that it's very difficult to make a difference. And this to me was quite interesting because it's something I've personally seen in living in China, where people think that it's very difficult to make a difference. Their own behavior doesn't necessarily have the impact they would like. Institutions are very hard to influence. And this came out very strongly in the data. It'd be interesting for advocates working in China to look how this might be remedied, how people can inspire young Chinese people to think more proactively about these issues and to address this potential apathy in the population. Another very interesting country-specific factor was that corporate-related barriers, so people who thought that problems in the environmental and animal spaces were caused by the private sector, caused by large corporates, perhaps greedy corporates. This viewpoint was particularly prominent in the US and Thailand, but not in China and Indonesia. And while a few of the findings from the study point to differences between, the West and the East, Europe and Asia, the global North and the global South, I find it interesting that we found these parallels between countries at the other side of the world. And it might be related to the way their economies are structured. But it's something I think that's potentially interesting to look into, how we might find these parallels with countries that don't necessarily seem closely related. And finally, we have a couple of recommendations for advocates I think would be interesting to mention. The main one is addressing emotional and practical barriers to action or careers. So we can get young people to boost their engagement by tackling issues such as career concerns, financial instability, potentially things like burnout that young people might face in their lives. We don't need to necessarily persuade people that they should care about the environment, because we find that people generally already do care about the environment and animals, not necessarily farm animals to the extent that we would like. That might be something else to focus on. But we found that generally young people are concerned about these issues. So we need to focus on these emotional and practical barriers. Secondly, I think we can shift the narrative from individual to systemic change, especially in countries like Indonesia, where we found that systemic change was neglected. I think that when engaging with young people, let them know that there are high impact systemic or high level solutions to problems. And these may well be more effective than grassroots solutions. Finally, one thing we noticed was that younger students in some Asian countries seem to lack exposure to environmental and animal issues. They don't necessarily have a good understanding or a good general knowledge on these issues. And I think one recommendation is to engage younger audiences early. So before university, if we can start engaging with Gen Z, it will give us opportunities to get young people to start thinking about these issues earlier, and perhaps generating a stronger youth advocacy movement for these issues. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Björn now.
Yeah, great analysis. I like the point you mentioned about engaging people early, even before university. We actually just did a study about a month ago on New Routes, which was a case study of high school and college outreach. So if you're curious about how that works, again, I think the results of that study were pretty optimistic. I would say we found that the intervention overall tends to be working. You can check out that study as well to see some ideas about how to implement this for Gen Z and even Gen Alpha, because they're approaching that age at this moment. We are going to jump into some audience questions now. So if you have a question based on the results, or even how to implement the results, you can put them in the group chat. I see a few already. So from Sean, Sean says, I thought it was interesting to see Thailand respondents were 3 times more likely to have considered a career in environment and animal protection. Why do you think the US was lower than anyone else, given that they also reported lower ratings for society, helping animals and the environment? Is it education, a lack of awareness, something like that? So, Jack, I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so we have a good answer to this question because we asked them why they did not consider a career, and they gave us quite detailed answers. Um, so the general trend in the US is that people have more concrete career plans at this stage in their life, and people seem to have fixed on another career path at quite a young age. And they often gave answers like, well, I studied this in university, so I did not so I've not considered this path. Um, Whereas people in Thailand and Indonesia in particular were more likely to have a more open career path. Perhaps they haven't committed to a certain field already. So I think it's probably mainly a difference in the way that people's careers and attitudes towards their careers are structured at that age. And yeah, and in terms of like, I don't think it's a huge difference in education or lack of awareness. I think it's yeah, more about the way that education is structured.
Yeah, great answer. So, if you're in the US, to me, this would indicate that to kind of get Gen Z, we might need to work with younger people, maybe Gen Alpha, before they have chosen a college major, university major. Or another possibility is to work on some sort of career training or more education for people who've already chosen a major, already chosen, or early career people in some other field. I think Animal Advocacy Careers has great courses on this, like 80,000 hours, has a couple more. So I think those tools might be a way to kind of get over that gap in the United States. Whereas if you're in Asia, perhaps you don't have to worry about that barrier quite as much and kind of work with students in university because the career path might not be as fixed. It's a really good insight. Okay, Sean has another question, which is how do we address practical barriers? Is it presentations in schools, tabling at career fairs, media? What do you think, Jack?
Yeah, this is a difficult one. I think on the one hand, it will be providing a selection of ideally career options or options to make an impact that don't currently exist, and informing young people about these options. Yeah, this might look like presentations at school. It might look like forming new organizations focused on this. Um, but yeah, I think this is an open question that yeah we don't have particularly strong insights based on this study, but yeah, I hope it is something that people will look into.
I agree. I think this is a tricky question because part of it is like financial concerns are not something. I mean, we can't just fix an economy as the animal protection movement. Like, we just don't have that power. Some of the, like, I think this also speaks to other threads of research Faunalytics has done about salaries and um, advocate retention and things like that. When we pay, it turns out, this should not be shocking to anybody, but when we pay people more, when we reduce burnout, we want to make sure that people's work is valued. They're more likely to stick around. So I think we can take those ideas and then kind of extend it to recruiting people into the movement because those practical and emotional barriers, I think it's important to mention, Jack, from the you mentioned earlier, that the barriers are also emotional. We can take the lessons that we've learned from retention and then apply it to recruitment. Money, gratitude. Um, a lot of people really want to see another thing that sticks out from other research. People want to see that their work has an impact. So they want to like almost quantify number of animals or number of like tons of carbon dioxide their work or their organization has saved and mitigated. So I think that is, again, the study didn't exactly examine this question, but I think it's an implication of the research that I think advocates can keep in mind. If anybody else has questions, you can put them in the chat, but I'll ask one of my own to you, Jack. What are what are some things you want to see activists do differently when they're messaging to Gen Z? Not trying to recruit them into the movement or work with them, but if you're trying to get them to perhaps change their behavior, either reducing meat consumption or voting a certain way or whatever it happens to be. What does the study indicate that activists should do? How should they change that framing, that messaging? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think one very important thing is helping people to know what to focus on, know what to prioritize. One thing that came out quite clearly in the data to me is that people have quite general sense of they want to improve the environment, they want to help animals, but we saw very little mention of like prioritization and choosing the most effective ways that you can attempt to help the environment. So I think help the environment or animals. So I think that one key messaging element that we need to consider is moving from you can do what you can make an effort to improve outcomes for animals and the environment. So you can really optimize, you can really prioritize elements that are neglected, that are tractable, that are impactful. And I think because we have this like latent care for animals in the environment, but we don't necessarily have this perspective on what's effective, on what will help the most animals and improve the environment the most effectively. Um, so yeah, I think my prioritization in messaging would be attempting to get young people, especially the kind of young people who might be interested in these kind of careers, to think about these questions of prioritization.
I want to follow up a little bit actually. So when you're saying prioritization, are you prioritizing essentially different causes in someone's life? Like how like ranking climate, environment, or is it more about like types of animals perhaps? Can you just give us a little bit more clarity on what you mean by prioritization?
Yeah, sure. So in the survey data, people often talked about companion animals. They talked about charismatic wild animals. They would very rarely talk about farmed animals. And as I'm sure most of the people on this call know, there's a very, very large number of farmed animals in the world compared to companion animals and charismatic wild animals. Um, and yeah, on the one hand, letting young people know that the suffering of these farmed animals is it generates more suffering in the world than the same things for companion animals and charismatic wild animals. And yeah, this is definitely one aspect of it. The other aspect is just knowing that, for example, with your career and with systemic attempts to improve these issues, you can definitely have a lot more impact um, than just reducing your than just mitigating your harms that you generate yourself. And again, this comes back to a key point of the study. People who act mainly will just act in a way that mitigates their own harm. They believe that they just want to like reduce the harm they do to society without realizing that they have the potential to do incredible good. And if they dedicate their careers to these areas, or if they try more creative solutions to engage much larger numbers of people, they can letting young people realize that they can have a huge impact on the environment and on animals in their country, I think will be very inspiring to them. And yeah, this is something that I would really focus on with messaging to young people in these countries.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Um, I don't see any more questions, but if anybody in the audience has them, you can come to Faunalytics office hours or email the study authors or Faunalytics themselves ourselves, and we can get you some answers. Thank you so much for coming. Perfect. We have just put the full report into the chat. I would strongly recommend you read it, especially if you live in one of these four countries. Make sure to read the country-specific findings. I really think that they're worthwhile gems in there for everybody to review. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks so much.